The Archive of Ivan Dragoyevich. When I answered the phone, all I heard was a succession of electronic noises. Whoop, whoop, clang! I knew from the moment that I heard those sounds that this was good news. Callum, you genius! Tell me you found something! I heard my friend laughing. Oh yes, he enthused. The entire archive, even the lost tapes. I'm holding the original version of theme for the ancient ones in my hand even as we speak. There was silence down the line, during which I knew that the little bastard was triumphantly waving a reel of magnetic tape at his phone. There's more though, he continued. I've not just found the missing archive, I think I've found the monster. Stay right there, I said, leaping into action. Don't you move until I get to exactly where you are. I hurled all my recording equipment into the back of the car and drove as fast as I could to meet Callum if he'd really located the lost archive of the late, great Ivan Dragoyevich, and especially the monster that he built. Then our many months of research were at an end. It all started when we were scouring old record shops for curios, and Callum discovered an album brilliantly titled The Puppet of the Dark Gods Strikes Back. Dating from the 70s, it ticked pretty much every box we had for kitsch retro appeal. How could we resist a triple vinyl concept album concerning a man's quest for both revenge and immortality, when none of the tracks clocked in at under 10 minutes? And they were all gloriously insane. The cover was a tall, intimidating man dressed as a medieval monk, his dark, accusing eyes staring out of the photo. This was Ivan Dragoyevich. Intrigued by this man we'd never heard of, we began searching for more information. From cult music forums, we learnt he emerged at the BBC radiophonic workshop in the early 60s before being thrown out for what was described in an internal memo as unprofessional, ritualistic behaviour. Further research revealed that he'd attempted to record demonic voices by holding a séance in a BBC studio when he should have been recording the new theme to Songs of Praise. Following his sacking, he seemed to have built a reputation both as an obnoxious perfectionist and an electronic music pioneer. We tracked down a former sound engineer who had worked with him briefly. No one seemed to work with him for long. And he spoke of Ivan's obsession with building from scratch what he termed the perfect recording device to contain forever the sounds of the universe. This machine Callum dubbed the Monster. I have to confess that we were even more enthused by our quest the more we learnt of Ivan's dark side. Newspaper cuttings revealed that in the late 70s, Ivan's reputation was fatally damaged when his estranged wife and only son were found dead. And while 2 subsequent trials found him not guilty, his music fell out of favour and he lived the last few years an embittered recluse. Our naive hopes of getting an interview faded when we read that in 1984 he'd been found dead. Apparently suicide. The body had been discovered next to what the pathologist's report described as a large recording device of the deceased's own construction. If this was the monster, then it seemed to disappear from the police investigation and off the face of the earth. Until now. In a tatty former police warehouse, in an aging industrial estate, Callum had found it. When I finally met him, he gloatingly led me to gaze upon the monster. It was magnificent. More than I'd hoped it would be. It was as if a large Stonehenge of filing cabinets had been hurled together into a single mass. Across its surface there were countless lights, levers and switches scattered at random. Bizarre hooks and rotating wheels filled the rest of the space, and at the far right of the machine there was an imposing black speaker the size of a doorway. As I stared in awe, Callum sidled up next to me and handed me a giant reel of magnetic tape. He'd selected a reel labelled "The Disobedient Are Punished." To be the first played through the monster, we delicately spooled the tape into the machine and flicked what we were reasonably confident was the play switch. Flibble. To our joy, sounds burst out the monster's giant speaker, but then a depressing sound. In panic, we saw the tape was being chewed and mangled by the machine. Callum leapt at the tape to save it, then screamed, "Ow! Fuck! Fucking hell!" In his haste, he badly cut the palm of his hand on one of the monster's many oddly located hooks. "Shit! Arsing shit!" he cursed angrily. The wound was deep, and his blood was now smeared all over his hand and where the monster had been reading the magnetic tape. Hurriedly, we patched him up and salvaged the tape. When we started again, though, the monster seemed to cooperate perfectly. We spent the next few hours recording the many soundscapes of the great Ivan onto my laptop, and we began to consider whether we might be able to make serious money from this stuff. Modern electronic artists might want to pay handsomely for downloads of these early forays into electronic music, especially if they have titles like this, mused Callum, holding up a reel entitled "You Have Been Found Wanting." That one we just had to play. But when we first spooled it through the machine, we figured we'd done something wrong. The monster was playing the tape, but no sound seemed to be coming out the speaker. I moved to restart the recording when Callum suddenly yelled, "Shh!" I froze. "Listen," he continued. "Can you hear that?" I strained to hear. And then, yes, there were voices on the tape. Quiet and mumbling. To try and work out what they were saying, Callum began increasing the volume. But while the background shh of the tape grew louder, the voices seemed to remain frustratingly incomprehensible. The volume was now beyond any setting we'd used before, and the large black speaker seemed to loudly reproduce every crackle on the tape. We seemed on the very brink of understanding what was being said. And I saw Callum's face freeze. He looked at me and whispered, "Oh God, I think there's something in there." A loud electronic crash burst from the speaker. With the volume now so high, the sudden noise was deafening. It tore through the room and I leapt startled. A split second later, I got my bearings back and I noticed to my horror that Callum was gone. I raced to the monster, calling out Callum's name. The voices were back coming through the speaker, and suddenly terrified, I turned off the power. The monster throbbed and the sound died. I was left in an all-consuming silence. "Callum!" I shouted hesitantly. "Callum! Are you there?" Nothing. "For fuck's sake, Callum, don't do this!" Nothing. No. Not nothing. I could faintly hear sobbing. I slowly turned round. The noise wasn't coming from the monster. It was coming from the back of the room, where we'd been piling up the reels of tapes. But now, among those reels, I could see that there was something new. It seemed to be a large clump of magnetic, tangled tape. I looked on and began to realise it wasn't just a clump. It had some sort of recognisable shape. I started walking towards it, convinced that the shape resembled a man. Too small for that. Maybe a child. I stared and began to make out more of the shape the chewed tape was forming. I imagined I could see that it resembled the form of someone sitting, hunched against the back wall. I began moving closer. This was no fancy of mine. This was the shape of a child. I could make out ever more detail now. 2 legs, a head buried in the hunched figure's crossed arms. More than that, the shoulders on this child form were convulsing in time with the sobbing noises. "Are you okay?" I instinctively asked. The crying suddenly stopped. I held my breath. With the child's head, a head of screwed up tape, lift up and look at me, I suddenly felt overwhelmed by a fear as to what would happen if its face did stare into mine. Slowly, though, I realized that wasn't what was happening. Instead, the tape was unraveling. The child was rapidly losing form as the tape seemed to unwind and untangle itself. I watched as it now began spooling itself across the room and towards the monster. Ba-doom, ba-shoom, ba-doom, ba-shoom. The monster had somehow started operating again. The lights flickered across the surface, pulsating in time to a steady beat of electronic noise. Reels of tape on the machine seemed to be spinning at ever-increasing speeds. I felt the throb grow more powerful, more insistent. Then a very sudden, urgent fear grabbed me. I sensed something was coming. Terrified, I got out my cigarette lighter and I leapt towards the monster. The tape proved highly flammable. Soon much of the exterior of the machine was burning, melting through the plastic and igniting materials within the monster itself. I began adding the archive to the flames. Whatever it was that Ivan Dragoyevich had put on those recordings was not going to be played again. As the fire grew stronger, thick, black, toxic smoke poured out the machine. I began coughing and realizing the danger I was in, I ran out the warehouse. I vomited and then I fainted. I awoke in a hospital bed a day later and learnt that the building and everything in it had been gutted by fire. Of my friend Callum there was still no trace. But as no body had been found, it was felt that he was probably in shock and would soon turn up. The police seemed at first convinced that I'd done something terrible. So I told them a version of events that would please a rationalist mind. An accidental fire as we handled aging electronics. With this and the lack of any damning evidence, they seemed to quickly get bored with the case. And within 24 hours of waking, I was discharged from the hospital. I consoled myself with the thought that whatever it was we'd encountered, the monster, I had managed somehow to stop. As I collected my things, I noticed that my phone had a message waiting for me from another friend. Anxious to hear an element of the normal world, I began listening to it. "Hi, Greg," it began. "Mike here. Just calling to say everyone on the Cult Music Forum is going wild over those music files you posted yesterday." My heart froze. We hadn't posted anything online. But I'm going to tell you now that that last one was a sick joke for you two to play on us. No way was that final track recorded back in the 70s. All that screaming and crying on the recording. Well, I recognise Callum's voice. Very funny, I don't think. When I next see the two of you, you both owe me a pint over that little scam. A sense of dread came over me. Maybe I'd misheard Mike. I pressed the button to replay the message, but what I heard the second time made me realize the story of Ivan Dragoyevich's monster was just beginning. In the background of the message, I could hear someone else in the room yelling, "Hey! Turn up the volume! I can't hear the voices!"